Snow cares nothing for innocence or damnation. It just buries both alike. Amos thumbed frost from his cracked lip, squinting down at the ruined pile of wool pitched into the snowbank. It shifted. Not a wounded calf, a woman, left to freeze by cowards who rode north. He spat, swearing. The tracks were fresh. 2 horses, heavy laden, churning up the powder in a hurried trot. Amos had been tracking a cougar that had been circling his lower traps, but these tracks broke his concentration. Men didn't ride this high up the ridge in late November unless they were running from something, or leaving something behind. He found her exactly where the riders had paused. The snow was trampled. A discarded canvas sack lay half buried near a cluster of dead pines, and then the bundle of wool. Amos knelt. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort. Comfort was a luxury the mountain didn't abide. He grabbed the edge of the heavy wool blanket and pulled it back. Her face was chalk white. The lips tinted a dangerous, bruised blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes. She was unconscious, her breathing so shallow it barely disturbed the frigid air. Amos pressed 2 rough, bare fingers against her throat. A pulse, faint, fluttering like a dying bird trapped behind glass. He looked north. The tracks disappeared over the crest of the ridge. 2 men. Her brothers, he'd later learn, though right now they were just ghosts in the snow. They had dumped her, discarded her like a broken wagon wheel. It wasn't the first time Amos had seen human cruelty, but the raw, utilitarian efficiency of it struck a sour chord in his gut. He didn't want this. He lived alone because people were a complication he had no stomach for. A woman dying in the snow was the worst kind of complication. He could leave her, walk away. The mountain would finish the job the men started. By spring, the scavengers would leave nothing but a sea-scatter of bones. He stood, adjusted his heavy coat, looked at the tree line. Then he looked back down. Amos swore again, a harsh, jagged sound in the quiet. Slung his rifle over his back, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of a rifle stock against a shoulder. He bent down and scooped her up. She was dead weight, literally. Her body was rigid, stiffening with the cold. He hoisted her over his shoulder, balancing her like a sack of grain, and began the long trudge back to his cabin. The cold of a high-country morning was a physical thing. It bit through his wool trousers, gnawed at his leather boots. Every breath felt like swallowing shattered glass. He walked for an hour, his thighs burning as he broke trail through knee-deep drifts. He didn't stop. Stopping meant freezing. His cabin appeared through the timber, a low, squat structure of peeled logs, blending into the rock face it was built against. No smoke rose from the chimney. It let the fire die down to embers before he left at dawn. Amos kicked the door open. The interior was dark, smelling of cured meat, wood smoke, and old sweat. He didn't own a bed, just a thick pallet of bear hides in the corner. He dumped her on it, not gently, just practically. Survival in the cold was a matter of mathematics. Core temperature minus exposure time. He moved quickly. He stripped off his heavy gloves and went to the hearth. He shoved a handful of dry pine needles and cedar bark into the embers, blowing on them until they caught. He piled on split kindling, then heavier logs. He turned back to the woman. Her clothes were damp. Wet wool was a death sentence. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the ingrained manners of a world he'd left behind, warring with brutal necessity. Necessity won. He drew his hunting knife and sliced through the laces of her leather boots, pulling them off. Her wool socks were soaked. He peeled them away. Her toes were pale, waxy, frostnip bordering on frostbite. He cut away her heavy outer skirt and the damp petticoats beneath, leaving her in her long cotton undergarments. He wrapped her tightly in 3 dry wool blankets, tucking the edges under her body to trap whatever heat she had left. He pulled a smooth, heavy river stone from the edge of the hearth, wrapped it in a scrap of burlap, and shoved it under the blankets at her feet. Then he sat in the scarred wooden chair by the fire and waited. He cleaned his rifle. The rhythmic click of the action, the smell of gun oil. It was a familiar ritual to anchor him in a day that had gone completely sideways. He watched her. She didn't stir for hours. The fire roared, pushing the chill to the corners of the room. The cabin grew sweltering. Amos stripped off his own coat and rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with faded white scars. Sometime around dusk, she moved, a violent, full-body shudder. The thawing process was agony. Aphens knew it well. Blood, forcing its way back into frozen capillaries, felt like being held over an open flame. A low moan escaped her lips. Her eyes fluttered open. They were brown, dark and flat like river mud. They didn't hold confusion. They held a terrifying, immediate clarity. She didn't scream. She didn't ask where she was. She looked at the raw log ceiling, then at the fire, and finally at the large man sitting in the corner with a rifle across his lap. "Jed and Hiram," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, scraping like dry leaves. "The men who rode north?" Amos asked. She offered a single tight nod. "My brothers." Amos said nothing. The silence in the cabin stretched out, heavy and thick. "They left me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered with a brutal lack of emotion. They did. She closed her eyes. She didn't cry. Amos watched her throat swallow, a hard, painful gulp. He recognized the look settling over her features. It was the look of an animal realizing the trap was shut. The panic was over. Only the bleak reality of survival remained. He set his rifle aside and stood. He walked to the cast-iron stove, picked up a tin cup, and poured it half full of strong black coffee that had been simmering on the edge of the grate. He walked over to the pallet. "Drink," he said, holding it out. She struggled to prop herself up on one elbow. Her hands shook violently. She reached for the cup, but her fingers couldn't grip the tin. Amos didn't offer pity. He simply knelt, put a calloused hand behind her neck to support her head, and tipped the cup to her lips. She drank. The liquid was scalding, but she didn't flinch. When it was gone, he lowered her back down. "I'm Amos," he said, turning away. "Ruth," she answered to his back. He didn't reply. He went back to the fire, tossed another log on the grate, and listened to the wind howl against the timber walls. She was alive. That was step one. What the hell he was supposed to do with her now was step two. And step two looked like a long, steep climb. Morning came with the metallic gray light of a storm that had blown itself out, leaving a bruised sky in its wake. Amos was up before the dawn, his movements quiet, efficient, practiced. Ruth was awake. He knew because the rhythm of her breathing had changed. She lay perfectly still on the pallet, tracking his movements through slitted eyes. She didn't trust him. He wouldn't have trusted him either. He made coffee, fried salted pork and cornmeal mush in a heavy skillet. The smell filled the cabin, thick and greasy. He scooped a portion onto a tin plate and set it on the floor near her blankets. "Eat," he said. He took his own plate to the table by the single frosted window and sat with his back to her. He heard the rustle of wool, the scrape of a tin fork. She ate like a starved wolf, fast, desperate, but trying to keep it silent. When he finished, Amos took his plate, wiped it clean with a rag, and began layering his cold-weather gear. "Where are you going?" Her voice stopped him at the door. "Trapline. Firewood." He didn't turn around. "Are you locking me in?" He looked over his shoulder. She was sitting up, the blankets clutched to her chest. Her face was hollowed out, dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes, but her jaw was set. "No lock on the door," Amos said flatly. "Ain't nothing out there but 70 miles of timber and cold. You want to run, you run, but you'll be dead by nightfall." Fact. He stepped out, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The air was sharp enough to cut. Amos picked up his splitting maul and went to work on a pile of seasoned oak rounds. The physical labor was a relief. The heavy thwack of the maul, the satisfying crack of wood splitting cleanly along the grain. He needed the exertion to burn off the restless energy that had settled in his bones. His space had been violated. For 5 years, this mountain had been his alone. He knew the habits of the elk, the migration patterns of the birds, the shifting moods of the weather. He knew nothing of this woman, except that her own blood had decided she was expendable. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached and his breath plumed in great white clouds. He stacked the split logs by the door, a towering monument to winter preparation. When he came back inside hours later, the cabin was different. The tin plates were washed and stacked near the bucket. The floor had been swept with the rough broom made of bound twigs. Ruth was sitting in the chair by the fire, wearing her dried cotton undergarments and wrapped in a blanket. She was trying to mend her ruined boots with a thick needle and sinew she had found on his work table. Amos stomped the snow off his boots. He took off his coat and hung it on a peg. He looked at the clean plates, then at her. "Didn't ask you to do that," he said. "Didn't ask for your permission," she replied without looking up. She struggled to push the thick needle through the stiff leather. Her fingers were red, swollen at the knuckles. Amos walked over. He reached down and took the boot and the needle from her hands. She stiffened, a flash of genuine panic crossing her face, but she didn't pull away. He sat on a low stool across from her. He pulled an awl from his pocket, punched a clean hole through the leather, and pushed the needle through with ease. He worked in silence, repairing the slice he'd made the night before. "Why did they leave you?" Amos asked. The question hung in the air, blunt and heavy. Ruth stared into the fire. The light caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. "We were headed for the Oregon Territory. Wagon broke an axle 100 miles back, lost most of our supplies. The horses were struggling with the weight." She paused. A muscle ticked in her jaw. 3 people, 2 horses, winter coming on fast. Jed did the math. I was the slowest. I was sick a few days back. Fever slowed us down. "So they dumped the excess cargo," Amos said. "No judgment, just an assessment of the facts." "Yes." "You hate them for it?" Ruth finally looked at him. Her eyes were dry. "Hate is a waste of energy. They wanted to live. I understand wanting to live." Amos tied off the sinew, bit the end clean, and tossed the boot into her lap. "Put it on. See if it holds." She pulled the boot onto her foot, lacing the remaining leather tight. It held. "I won't be a burden," Ruth said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce register. "I know how to work. I can cook, clean, skin a hare. When the thaw comes, I'll walk down the mountain and you'll never see me again. But until then, I pull my weight." Amos studied her. Most people he knew would be weeping, cursing God, demanding retribution. She was just negotiating her survival. He respected that. It was the only language he truly understood. "Touch my rifles without asking, I'll throw you out in the snow myself," Amos said. "Understood. You don't go past the tree line alone. There's a pack of timber wolves pushing south. They're hungry." "Understood. Water comes from the creek. It freezes over at night. Have to break the ice with the iron bar. I can do that." Amos stood up. He walked to the corner, pulled a half-wool shirt and a pair of canvas trousers from a chest, and tossed them at her. "They'll be too big," he said. "Roll the sleeves. I'm going to check the lower traps. Have dinner ready when I get back." He didn't wait for her to answer. He took his rifle and left. As he walked down the mountain, the silence of the woods felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. There was a tether pulling at his back, anchored to the cabin. He didn't like the feeling. But as he adjusted his grip on his rifle, he admitted one thing to himself. He didn't entirely hate it either. Winter tightened its grip on the mountain. The snow piled higher, burying the lower branches of the pines and silencing the world. Time became measured not by days on a calendar, but by the relentless cycle of wood, water, fire, and food. A fragile architecture of routine built itself between them. Amos woke first, coaxing the embers back to life. Ruth made breakfast. Amos hunted. Ruth mended, cooked, and maintained the cabin. They moved around each other like two wary dogs in a small pen. Careful, measured. The cabin was roughly 20 by 20 feet. It left no room for privacy, forcing an intimacy neither of them had invited. Amos watched her. He noted the way she rolled the cuffs of his oversized trousers so they wouldn't drag. He noticed how she never complained about the cold, even when he saw her hands trembling as she brought water back from the creek. The sound of a creek running under ice was a constant background hum to her morning chore, a muffled, hollow rushing that meant winter had locked the water down tight. She had to smash the surface with a heavy iron spud bar every morning just to fill the buckets. She was stubborn, relentlessly so. One afternoon, Amos returned from a fruitless hunt. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, threatening more snow. He stepped into the cabin and stopped. Ruth was standing by the work table, wrestling with a haunch of venison Amos had dragged in 2 days prior. She had his large butcher knife and was trying to hack through the bone to portion the meat. She was using her body weight, leaning into the blade, but she didn't have the leverage. Amos unbuttoned his coat. "You're dulling my blade on the bone." She froze, chest heaving, a smear across the back of her hand where she had wiped her brow. She looked at him, defiant. "I'm trying to make a stew. It needs marrow." "You don't chop bone with a knife," Amos said. He crossed the room. He didn't ask her to move. He just stepped up beside her. The proximity was sudden. He could smell the wood smoke in her hair, the faint scent of lye soap, the metallic tang of the raw meat. She stiffened, leaning away slightly, but she didn't retreat. Amos reached out and covered her hand with his. His hand was massive, rough as a rasp, swallowing hers completely. He felt her flinch at the contact. It was the first time they had touched since he carried her through the snow. "Let go," he said quietly. She released the handle. Amos picked up a heavy meat cleaver resting on the edge of the table. He took the haunch with his left hand, positioning it precisely. "Watch," he instructed. He brought the cleaver down in a short, brutal, controlled arc. A sharp crack echoed in the cabin as the blade sheared cleanly through the bone. He did it twice more, separating the meat into perfect, even chunks. He set the cleaver down and stepped back, instantly restoring the boundary between them. "Stew needs onions," Amos said, turning away to hang his rifle on the wall hooks. "Bottom barrel, left side." Ruth stared at the chopped meat. She swallowed hard, rubbing her knuckles. "Thank you. Just don't ruin my knives," he muttered. The tension in the cabin shifted after that. It didn't soften. Softness had no place here, but the sharp edges of their mutual suspicion began to dull. Later that week, the storm finally hit. It wasn't just a snowfall. It was a whiteout blizzard that roared down the canyon like a freight train. The wind shrieked through the gaps in the chinking, packing snow against the windshield until it blocked out the light entirely. They were sealed in. By the second day of the storm, cabin fever began to set in. The heat from the stove was oppressive, yet the walls radiated a creeping frost. Amos sat in his chair, whittling a piece of cedar into a new handle for an awl. Ruth sat on the floor near the hearth, mending a tear in one of his spare blankets. The silence, usually comfortable for Amos, felt heavy, loaded with unsaid things. "Did you build this place?" Ruth asked suddenly, without looking up from her stitching. Amos stopped carving. He looked at her, mostly. "Found the foundation of an old trapper's shack. Built the rest up from the logs. How long have you been up here?" 5 winters. She pulled the needle through the wool. Why? It was a dangerous question. Men who lived in the high country didn't ask each other, why? It was understood that you were either running from the law, a bad debt, or a memory. Amos looked at the wood shavings gathered by his boots. "World got too crowded," he said finally. So you came to a place where the nearest neighbor is 100 miles away. Trees don't talk, animals don't lie, snow don't judge. Amos went back to carving. It's an honest life. Ruth let out a short, humorless breath. Honest, maybe, but it's a lonely way to die. We all die lonely, Ruth, Amos said, his voice dropping into a register that brooked no argument. Whether you're in a city of thousands or on a mountaintop. Your brothers proved that. When the fire gets too hot, people look out for themselves. She stopped sewing. She looked up at him, her dark eyes flashing with sudden fierce heat. Not everyone, she said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear, but from an anger she had kept buried since the day he found her. Not everyone runs. I ain't met a person yet who wouldn't. You didn't. The words hit the air and hung there. Amos froze. You found me, she continued, her voice gaining strength, cutting through the heavy air of the cabin. You could have walked away. You said yourself it's survival of the fittest up here. I was dead weight, but you picked me up. You brought me here. Why? Amos stared at her. The cedar stick in his hand felt fragile. He didn't have an answer, not a logical one. He had told himself it was instinct, a momentary lapse in judgment. But looking at her now, seeing the firelight dancing in her eyes, seeing the raw, unyielding grit of a woman who refused to break, he knew it was something else. He had seen a reflection of his own jagged soul lying in that snowbank, abandoned, discarded. Before Amos could formulate a lie, the sound cut through the howl of the blizzard outside. It was a low, resonant scratch at the heavy oak door, followed by a heavy thud, as if a large body had bumped against the timber. Amos stood up instantly, dropping the wood and the knife. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing his rifle off the wall. "What is it?" Ruth asked, her anger evaporating, replaced by sharp alert. She scrambled to her feet. "Quiet," Amos hissed. He pressed his ear against the cold wood of the door. Another scratch, heavier this time, wood splintering. Then a sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. A low, vibrating growl, deep enough to rattle the floorboards. "Timber wolf," Amos muttered, jacking around into the chamber. "A big one. Smells the venison. Will the door hold? It's thick oak. But if he's hungry enough, he'll try to dig out the threshold." Amos backed away from the door, raising the rifle to his shoulder. Suddenly, a second thud hit the wall near the window, then a third. Amos's eyes narrowed. It ain't just one. It's the whole pack. He looked at Ruth. She wasn't cowering. She had moved to the table and picked up the heavy meat cleaver, gripping it with white knuckles. Her stance was wide, ready. Amos felt a strange, tight pull in his chest. In 5 years he had faced every danger on this mountain alone. If he died, he died. But now there was someone else in the room, someone who had drawn a line in the dirt and stood beside him. "Get behind the stove," Amos commanded. "If they breach the window, they'll come through fast." "I can fight," she said stubbornly. "I know you can," Amos said, and he realized he meant it. "But the rifle speaks louder than the cleaver. Move." She hesitated, then stepped back, positioning herself near the cast-iron stove, giving him a clear line of sight to both the door and the window. The wind shrieked outside, mocking them. A heavy body slammed against the window shutter. The thick wood groaned, protesting the weight. Amos sighted down the barrel, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He didn't look at Ruth, but he could feel her presence at his back, a solid, unyielding heat in the freezing room. For the first time in a very long time, Amos was afraid. Not for his own life. The shutter cracked, a jagged line of frost splitting down the center. Amos held his breath. Folks used to pull their chairs closer to the hearth when the wind picked up, sharing tales to keep the dark at bay. We are doing the same thing here, just across a wider distance. If you found some warmth in this telling, hit the like button. Subscribe to keep your seat by the fire. Share it with someone who knows what it means to survive the winter. We have got more ground to cover. I will see you then. The shutter gave way with the sound of a snapping bone. Wood splinters exploded inward, carrying a violent spray of snow and the bitter stench of wet fur. A mass of gray muscle and yellow teeth shoved through the opening. The wolf didn't howl. It snarled, a wet guttural noise of pure starvation. It scrambled against the inner sill, front claws gouging deep tracks into the wood, fighting for purchase. Amos fired. The heavy rifle boomed in the confined space, a deafening roar that punched the air out of the room. The slug caught the beast square in the chest. The impact threw the animal backward, tumbling it out into the howling white. Amos broke the action. The spent brass casing clattered against the floorboards, smoking. He reached into his pocket for another cartridge, his thumb sliding over the cold lead. He was a fraction of a second too slow. A second wolf launched through the shattered window. It hit the floor, scrambling on the slick, blood-spattered wood. Its yellow eyes locked instantly onto Amos. The rifle was open, empty. The animal lunged, jaws snapping toward his throat. Amos braced, raising the heavy steel barrel of the rifle horizontally to take the bite. A blur of motion swept past his left shoulder. Ruth didn't scream. She stepped directly into the wolf's path, gripping the meat cleaver with both hands. She swung it like a splitting maul, driving it down with her entire body weight. The heavy, flat steel connected with the thick muscle of the animal's neck. A sickening, dense crunch echoed above the wind. The wolf dropped. Its momentum carried it forward, crashing heavily into Amos's shins. It thrashed once, jaws snapping at empty air, and went still. Cold air poured through the broken window, sucking the heat from the cabin in seconds. "Reload," Ruth gasped. She didn't drop the cleaver. She stood over the dead animal, chest heaving, her knuckles white. Amos shoved the cartridge home and snapped the action shut. He stepped over the carcass and moved to the window, leveling the barrel into the dark. Nothing but swirling snow met his sights. The sharp crack of the rifle and the death of 2 packmates had broken their nerve. The remaining wolves had scattered into the timber. Amos lowered the rifle. His ears rang, a high, thin whine cutting through the sound of the wind. The smell of burnt sulfur choked the air, mixing heavily with the copper scent of blood. He looked at Ruth. She was staring at the dead wolf on the floor. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was receding, leaving the brutal reality of what had just happened in its wake. Amos walked past her, grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the pallet, and shoved it into the broken window frame. He jammed a heavy oak chair against it to hold it in place. It wouldn't keep the cold out completely, but it would stop the snow. He turned back. Ruth hadn't moved. Amos set the rifle on the table. He stepped close to her, reached out, and closed his large hand over her trembling fingers. He gently pried the cleaver from her grip. He tossed it onto the table. "You're bleeding," she whispered, looking at his arm. Amos glanced down. A ragged tear in his woolen sleeve revealed a shallow gash on his forearm. A stray claw had caught him during the struggle. He hadn't felt it. "It's shallow," he said. Ruth shook her head. She walked to the stove, poured hot water from the kettle into a tin basin, and grabbed a clean strip of cotton from her mending pile. She carried it back to the table. "Sit," she ordered. Amos didn't argue. He sat in the sturdy wooden chair. He rolled up his sleeve, exposing the bloodied skin. Ruth washed the wound. Her touch was efficient, devoid of unnecessary gentleness, but careful. The hot water stung. Amos didn't flinch. He watched her face. The hollows under her cheekbones were shadowed in the dim light of the lantern. Her jaw was clamped shut, a hard line of absolute resolve. She wasn't dead weight. She never had been. "I've never killed anything before," she said quietly as she bound the wound with the cotton strip. She didn't look at him. She focused entirely on the knot. "You didn't hesitate," Amos noted. "If you die, I die. The math hasn't changed." She tied off the bandage and stepped back. Amos stood up. He walked to the dead wolf on the floorboards. Survival left no room for waste, not even now. "Get a bucket from the corner," Amos said, drawing his skinning knife from his belt. "We butcher it tonight. If we leave it, the smell will bring the rest of the pack back before dawn." They worked for hours. The storm raged outside, burying the cabin deeper in the drift, but inside, the rhythm of necessary labor anchored them. Amos skinned and quartered the animal. Ruth cleaned the blood from the floorboards, boiling water and scrubbing the wood until her hands were raw. When it was done, the meat hung from the rafters in the cold corner of the cabin, the pelt stretched and salted. The fire in the stove burned down to a dull, pulsing cherry red. The cabin was freezing, the makeshift window patch failing to hold back the bitter chill. Amos sat on the floor, his back against the rough logs of the wall, a heavy blanket draped over his shoulders. Ruth sat a few feet away, wrapped in her own blankets. The space between them was small, but the silence was immense. It was no longer the silence of suspicion. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet of two people who had stood on the edge of the dark and pulled each other back. Amos looked at her profile in the dying light. "You saved my life. You saved mine first," she replied, softly. He didn't offer a rebuttal. He let his head rest back against the timber, listening to the wind tear at the roof. The mountain was a brutal host, but for the first time in 5 years, Amos felt something other than isolation within its walls. He felt the terrifying, heavy burden of gratitude. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving a transformed world. The snow was blindingly bright, piled in drifts that reached the cabin's eaves. Amos spent a full day repairing the window. He fashioned a new shutter from heavy planks, securing it with iron hinges and a thick wooden crossbar. Ruth maintained the fire, melting snow for water, stretching their rations to account for the days they couldn't hunt. Weeks bled into one another. The deep freeze of January gave way to the unpredictable, biting winds of February. Their routine hardened into a seamless choreography. Amos didn't need to ask for coffee in the mornings. It was ready when he laced his boots. Ruth didn't need to ask for firewood. The stack by the door was perpetually replenished. They anticipated each other's movements, reading the subtle shifts in posture and breath that communicated more than words ever could. Amos found himself lingering near the cabin. He checked his traps, hunted the ridges, but the immense stretches of time he used to spend wandering. Thigh-high timber felt empty now. The pull of the cabin, the smell of wood smoke, and the quiet presence of the woman within it drew him back earlier each day. He noticed things. He noticed the way she hummed a low, tuneless vibration in her chest when she was working a tough seam. He noticed the calluses hardening on her palms, mirroring his own. He noticed that she stopped watching the wagon trail that wound through the lower valley. But as February surrendered to March, the air began to change. It started as a subtle softening in the wind. The hard, brittle cold lost its edge, replaced by a damp, heavy chill. The snowpack began to compress, the top layer turning to granular ice during the day and freezing solid at night. Then came the sound, a muffled hollow rushing deep beneath the ice of the creek. The water was waking up. Amos stood on the porch, his breath no longer pluming in the air, listening to the hidden current. He gripped the wooden railing until the splinters bit into his palm. Spring was coming. The thaw. The math of their arrangement had been clearly stated on her first day. "When the thaw comes, I'll walk down the mountain, and you'll never see me again." He turned and looked through the open door. Ruth was sitting at the table, polishing the steel of his hunting knife with a rag and a drop of oil. She looked up at him. She heard the water, too. The agreement hung in the room, sudden and suffocating. Neither of them spoke. April arrived with the violence of a breaking dam. The snow didn't melt gracefully. It rotted, Great slabs of it slid from the pine branches, crashing heavily to the muddy forest floor. The creek roared, a torrent of brown, freezing water that tore at the banks and dragged dead timber downstream. The mountain smelled of wet earth, crushed pine needles, and decay. Inside the cabin, a suffocating tension had taken root. The seamless choreography of winter had dissolved into stiff, measured movements. Every clatter of a tin plate, every scrape of a chair, felt magnified. Amos spent long hours outside, splitting wood they wouldn't need until next winter, sharpening tools that were already razor-edged. He avoided the cabin. He avoided the sight of the canvas sack sitting by the foot of her pallet. Ruth was packing. She took only what was strictly necessary. A spare shirt Amos had given her, a chunk of salted venison, 2 hardtack, biscuits, a heavy wool blanket. She folded everything with meticulous, infuriating precision. Amos stood in the doorway, mud caking his boots, watching her tie the top of the sack. "Trail's mostly clear below the ridge," Amos said. His voice sounded like it was scraping over gravel. "Mud's deep, but the snow's gone. Wagon road to the settlement is passable." Ruth didn't look up. She tightened the knot on the sack. "How many miles to the settlement?" 20. "I can make that in 2 days, if the weather holds." She finally stood and faced him. She was wearing her mended boots, the thick canvas trousers, rolled at the ankle, and a heavy wool sweater. She looked rugged, capable. She looked like she belonged to the mountain. "I've taken enough of your time, Amos," she said. Her tone was flat, stripped of any inflection. Amos stepped into the room. He walked to his wooden chest at the foot of his pallet. He opened it, dug past the spare ammunition and trapping supplies, and pulled out a heavy oiled deck's canvas coat. He threw it on the table next to her sack. "Wind's still sharp in the valley," he said. Ruth stared at the coat. She didn't reach for it. "I have my blanket. Take the coat." It wasn't a request. She looked at him. For a moment the flat composure of her face cracked, revealing a flash of something desperate and raw underneath. She swallowed hard, her throat working. "Are you going to walk me down?" she asked. "To the crossroads. Keep you clear of the creek crossing. It's washed out." He turned his back, grabbed his rifle from the wall hooks, and stepped outside. The walk down the mountain was agonizing. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the heavy suction of their boots in the deep mud and the distant roar of the Swolsen Creek. Amos led the way, setting a punishing pace. He wanted this over. He wanted the tearing sensation in his chest to stop. He wanted his solitary, silent mountain back. He lied to himself with every step. They walked for 3 hours, descending through the timberline until the dense pines gave way to scattered scrub oak and open meadows choked with pale, dead grass from the previous year. At the bottom of a steep incline, the trail forked. One path led back up into the high country. The other, wider and rutted with old wagon tracks, led out toward the plains. The settlement. Amos stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He stared at the wagon ruts filled with muddy, gray water. Ruth stopped a few paces behind him. He heard the rustle of the canvas sack as she shifted its weight on her shoulder. Amos turned. She looked exhausted, her face flushed with the exertion of the hike, a smudge of dirt across her cheek. The oversized canvas coat hung heavily on her frame. She looked at the road, then at him. "This is it," Amos said. "Yes. Follow the ruts. Keep the sun on your left shoulder. You'll hit the outpost before nightfall tomorrow, I know." Silence fell between them, heavier than the mud clinging to their boots. It was the silence of 2 people standing on the edge of a vast, empty canyon, neither willing to be the first to shout into the void. Amos gripped the stock of his rifle. His knuckles turned white. He had survived blizzards, starvation, and the jaws of a wolf by relying on cold, hard logic. Logic dictated she leave. Logic dictated he return to his cabin. But logic couldn't explain the cold, hollow ache expanding in his gut. Ruth adjusted the strap of her sack. She took a step toward the wagon road. "Thank you, Amos," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "For the fire, for the food, for not leaving me." She turned her back and began to walk. One step, two. Amos watched her go. He watched the distance grow between them. The mountain felt massive suddenly, empty. The silence he had craved for 5 years suddenly felt like a physical threat, a crushing weight that would bury him just as surely as the snow had almost buried her. He dropped his rifle. The heavy thud of the steel and wood hitting the mud stopped Ruth in her tracks. She turned around slowly. Amos stepped forward. He didn't close the entire distance, but he crossed the invisible line that separated his path from hers. He stood in the mud, his chest rising and falling, his guard-eyed eyes entirely stripped of their defense. "I ain't used to the quiet anymore," he said. The words were ragged, torn from somewhere deep inside him. Ruth stood perfectly still. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair across her face. Amos took another step. "World down there is full of cowards, people who leave when the weight gets too heavy. You ain't one of them." He paused, his jaw working as he fought for the words he had never learned to speak. He settled for the only truth he knew how to offer. "Mountain's better with you on it." Ruth stared at him, the flat survivalist mask she had worn for months completely shattered. Her dark eyes filled, the tears spilling over, instantly cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. She looked down the wagon road toward the settlement, toward safety, toward civilization. Then she looked back at the rugged, scarred man standing in the mud. She dropped the canvas sack. It hit the ground with a wet slap. She closed the distance between them. She didn't run, but her steps were fast, deliberate. When she reached him, she didn't say a word. She simply reached out, grabbed the rough wool of his shirt, and buried her face in his chest. Amos froze for a fraction of a second. Then his massive arms came up, wrapping around her, pulling her tight against him. He buried his face in her hair, smelling the wood smoke and the sharp, clean scent of the cold air. He held her with the fierce, desperate grip of a man who had found something worth keeping in a world designed to take everything away. They stood there in the mud, surrounded by the rotting snow and the rushing water, anchoring each other against the thaw. After a long time, Amos pulled back slightly. He looked down at her. He didn't smile. It wasn't in his nature, but the hardness in his eyes was gone. He stepped back, bent down, and picked up his rifle from the mud. He wiped the action clean on his sleeve. Then he reached down and picked up her canvas sack, slinging it effortlessly over his shoulder. He looked back up the steep trail toward the timberline, toward home. "Fire's probably died down," he said. Ruth fell in step beside him. She bumped her shoulder against his arm, a solid grounding point of contact. "Then we'll build it back," she said. They turned away from the wagon road and began the long climb up the mountain, walking together into the timber. Folks used to pull their chairs closer to the hearth when the wind picked up, sharing tales to keep the dark at bay. We are doing the same thing here, just across a wider distance. If you found some warmth in this telling, hit the like button. Subscribe to keep your seat by the fire. Share it with someone who knows what it means to survive the winter. We have got more ground to cover. I will see you then.